Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel on emerging trends in insolvency and bankruptcy. We have a fantastic panel here. And actually, I would like to ask everyone to please briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Lisa Hebert. I'm a partner at the law firm Borden Ladner Gervais, and I practice insolvency and restructuring law, working with companies that owe money, the court officers that get involved in formal proceedings, and also advising creditors, including lenders and secured creditors.
Thanks, Lisa. My name is Claire Weldon, and I am a Vice President in the PwC Deals Group, focusing primarily in corporate advisory and restructuring. And I'm also a licensed insolvency trustee, and my team take on all sorts of engagements from pure advisory right through to monitor roles under the CCAA and trustee in bankruptcy. So we work with companies and lenders, both those experiencing challenges and those unfortunately have decided to wind up their operations.
I'm Kent Kufelt. I'm also a partner at Borden Ladner Gervais. I've been a corporate public securities and capital markets lawyer with a lot of M&A focus for the last 30 years. So I've done a considerable amount of M&A work in my career, and a reasonable amount of M&A within the insolvency or restructuring context, either assisting Lisa and other of our restructuring partners and helping clients that are in the restructuring process in selling assets or dealing with those types of matters, as well as advising purchasers who are looking at purchasing businesses or assets in a distressed situation.
Great. Thank you very much, all. So I'm very excited about our panel today. As many of you know, restructuring and insolvency matters are actually on the rise across Canada due to the COVID-19 pandemic and related shutdowns. So without any further delay, I would like to start off the discussion by asking, what does the landscape look right now? What has been happening this year, and what sectors might be hit hardest and why? Kent, perhaps you would like to start off the discussion.
Sure, happy to. I'm not going to say anything that I don't think anybody that reads the paper or watches the news is not aware of. But, really we are experiencing the most significant recession that any of us will have experienced in our lifetimes. I mean, there's been, massive job losses throughout the COVID pandemic. Alberta had an unemployment rate of around 7%, British Columbia slightly under 6%. If you look at it from a GDP perspective, the data I have for BC says that our productivity or GDP in BC is down 7.5%, which, to put it in context, is at least 3 times larger than the declines that we saw in the Great Recession of 2008. So that is a significant drop in productivity, and that's been experienced across the Canadian economy, not just in British Columbia. And while we have come back out of lockdown and business has started to resume, forecasts for the businesses, at least in BC, for 2021 is forecasted at a very robust 4.5%. But when you look at that in the context of a 7.5% drop, there still is a reduction in economic activity that is greater than the 2008 recession. So lots of difficulty ahead for Canadian businesses. The impacts, I think, have been felt differently across industries. It is, some industries have done fairly well. Certainly resources, agriculture, those industries have ticked along. Others that are obvious, like smaller businesses in the restaurant, hospitality sector, travel, those businesses are obviously much more severely impacted. But the one thing about the COVID-19 pandemic and resulting recession is that it's A, across the economy, and B, it's worldwide. So for even companies that are doing quite well, they have to look beyond just their own business and look at how this pandemic is affecting suppliers and other counterparties, because it is so broad-based and wide-reaching.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Kate. And sorry, please go ahead, Lisa.
No, I think that part of the economy has been very hard hit. No one is unaffected by this. But what has been, I think, a surprise for a lot of people is that there's been a bit of a delay in those economic impacts resulting in formal proceedings or parties taking action. A lot of the companies that you see in distress right now are companies that came into the pandemic already with some pre-existing problems. And COVID wasn't the cause of those financial difficulties, but they may have acted as, it may have been an accelerant or the tipping point that just pushed them over the edge. And a surprising number of companies have found themselves able to continue when they might not have otherwise been able to, because they have the benefit of government subsidies. They're able to significantly reduce their costs because they can shutter locations. They're able to negotiate with their landlords if they have enough locations. And the banks and the lenders have been, I think in a lot of cases, pretty patient in taking action for a variety of reasons. They don't want, I think a lot of lenders don't want to take action in unprecedented times, because that results in them enforcing when the market for those assets may not be that strong. And so I think there's a lot of companies that are in a bit of a holding pattern right now, and there will be some further challenges that they're going to face as they come to the end of government subsidies, as the banks start to lose patience, and they start having fewer levers that they can pull in terms of improving their balance sheet.
Yeah, no, I would agree with everything Lisa said there. I guess from our perspective, we are quite busy at the moment, but everything that we are working on is really not necessarily a symptom of COVID. These are companies and businesses that were facing challenges prior to the pandemic. And unfortunately, things just obviously haven't improved for them during that time frame. But what is interesting is the extent of that support that is available, be it from the government subsidies or the banks, and concessions from landlords. Everyone is, it would appear, trying to work through this in the most constructive way possible. For example, 3 of the sort of main engagements my team is working on at the moment, while they're in a range of industries as well, so this is industry agnostic. They're actually really ahead of where anyone thought they would have been 6 months ago, and that's not because they've had an improvement in trading and revenues have improved or anything. It's actually because of the support they're receiving from the government through the wage subsidies or the deferred taxes, and a number of them are not actually having to pay rent, or it's a really reduced amount. So they're actually better off from a cash perspective than they expected to be. So it's a fairly unusual circumstance to find yourself in when you hear the statistics that Kent obviously mentioned earlier. To be performing better than expected in those sort of circumstances is quite unusual.
Very interesting, thank you. And if I can follow up, actually, Lisa, you mentioned with respect to the banks that they may lose patience at some point. So I would actually like to ask you that how banks are preparing at the moment to engage with the distressed companies, what strategies they're using, and what's really going on in reality beyond what we could see in the headlines.
Yeah, well, when you're dealing with banks, they're always evaluating their risk and evaluating their loan portfolios, and every bank has a group within it that is tasked with managing their distressed loans, or the loans that they have some concerns about that are moving into a different risk profile. They often, a lot of them are called the special loans groups, very euphemistically. But what they're doing, and through this pandemic, is those teams have been bulking up. They've been adding people to them because they expect that the pandemic is going to result in a lot of businesses having challenges, and they're needing to take a more active role in monitoring their risk and making sure that their exposure isn't crossing over to something they're not comfortable with. But they are, when you're dealing with a bank, they're very pragmatic. And at the end of the day, they care about managing their risk and making sure that they can get repaid. And so they evaluate the business, and they do try to get a sense of whether or not the business being off, whether it's they're off their financial covenants or they're missing payments. They try to get a sense of whether that's a fundamental problem with the business, or if that's a short-term issue that can be worked through. And they're also evaluating the nature of their collateral, because if the bank finds itself in a situation where they have to enforce their rights, which they don't want to do, they don't have to, they will appoint a receiver or put the company into bankruptcy, and the assets sold. So they're really looking at what are the hard assets, what can possibly be sold, and they evaluate the market. And that's part of why the pandemic and the uncertainty there has caused some delay in action, because it's not a good situation to be trying to sell assets into a really uncertain market.
I do a lot in the oil and gas industry, and we're seeing a lot of what I call amend, extend, and pretend. So as Lisa says, they're amending their credit agreement to deal with their potential covenant defaults or covenant shortfalls in the current environment to reflect existing existing commodity prices and those types of things. They're putting companies on very short leashes, so they're extending their credit facilities out. They may be due December 31. They're extending them just by a couple of months. We're going to keep you on a very short leash. Watch how things transpire. They're putting them on a lot more borrowing-based reserve. Looks at. They're looking to see how their commodity prices have affected their reserves, and if that starts to go downhill, then they'll start to pull the plug quicker. So very, very short leash with a lot of lenders. And I think that goes across industries as well. I just see it in the oil and gas. And then the pretend one, I think, is a little bit of the tongue in cheek, but it goes to some of the things Lisa talked about earlier is banks don't want to be the first to pull the plug. They want to pretend that things are okay, keep people, relatively calm in an orderly fashion, but I think they are preparing the worst.
Claire, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I guess I would just say the same. We have seen a reasonable amount of support, I guess, coming from the lenders at the moment. And I guess the big question out there at the moment is, how long can that last? I know there were a number of regulatory sort of amendments brought in the early stages of the pandemic to allow for sort of loan deferrals and that not to have an impact on the capital that the banks had to allocate. But I know those are winding off. And as Lisa mentioned, the banks are managing their own risks, and they are businesses themselves. So while there's a balancing act between them, managing their businesses and doing the good corporate citizen thing that people may sort of say they do or they don't at the best of times. So we are watching for that sort of an indication as to when that balance may switch, because at the moment, we've seen a lot of support coming from the lenders. So.
Thank you. And I would actually like to put a question to all of you. The picture doesn't look great, and makes me wonder what we can expect to see in 2021, especially if the government assistance programs and all sorts of guarantees and stimulus that we currently see will be phased out. So are we expecting to see a significant rise in the restructuring or insolvencies, or what's your perspective on the challenges going forward?
I think no one has a crystal ball, but I think most people are expecting 2021 to start to see the end of the government subsidies, and hopefully they have a plan for scaling those down in an orderly way and not a hard stop, because a hard stop will not be good. But I think most people do expect that 2021 is when there's going to be a lot more activity, because that's when things are going to start to stabilize, especially if there's a turn to what looks more like we would consider normal.
And I think that's the one, there's a lot of conversations around at the moment of what is normal. And, sort of, we've been discussing three groups of sort of categories. There's those people who are just unfortunately probably, won't survive the pandemic because this is, a long-term shift in their business model that they just don't have the financial means to sort of sustain. And then there are those that are sort of relying on everything returning to pre-COVID levels to support their operations that, they had prior to the pandemic. And, whether or not that's going to happen and across the board is still very much in question. We've done a number of surveys across the firm, and there's some interesting data coming out about the changes in consumer behaviours and what that's going to drive. Your end customer may not be necessarily the customer you thought they were, or they're not looking at things in life the way they were pre-pandemic. So the businesses that can sort of adapt and pivot to those to respond to those changing consumer sort of behaviors are the ones who are going to do the best out of this scenario and stand to actually come out the other end better. But where people fall in that spectrum between sort of just hoping that life gets back to pre-pandemic stages to actually using this as an opportunity to pivot is really going to I think drive how much activity we do see as restructuring professionals.
So I think this is the perfect time actually to shift the discussion a little bit to the defensive strategies that are available to companies which are facing restructuring or insolvency. So I would like to start off this discussion by asking that what companies can do in different stages of difficulty. And to put it differently, what could they do before the government support programs will phase out? And I think there is an expectation that this is not sustainable. And at some point, all these support programs will end. And so it would be great to get your thoughts on the defensive strategies that actually could be used by companies proactively, which are facing financial challenges.
I think I might start just because I'll offer the higher level, the 10,000 foot perspective from a corporate and director type of perspective. But I think one of the things that we always advocate, which I think is tough for companies to accept, is that when they have to come to terms with the fact that they are distressed, and many companies are distressed, and it goes against the natural inclination of many business people to accept defeat. They can always work it out. It'll always be better. But the advice that I would give, and the advice I am giving my clients, is be proactive in seeking out the ways to pivot or to work your way through this crisis. As Claire said, I mean, engage advisors, engage people like PwC and legal counsel. Get advice. Understand your options now. Because the one thing that happens in insolvency and when you enter what people call the zone of insolvency is that time accelerates. Time is not your friend. And if we have a little bit of a respite right now, the banks aren't pulling the plugs, the government financing isn't coming off abruptly, but it's going to come off. Now's the time to take very proactive steps to figure out how you can engage with your debtors, your bankers, cut costs, pivot your business. Take those proactive steps that may help you avoid restructuring, or if you have to restructure, be in a much better place than having to react when you're back on your heels and facing the banker at the door asking for your keys.
Yeah, I think a big misconception is that insolvency is just a factual state. It's that your assets are worth less than the value of your liabilities, or your cash flow isn't enough to meet your obligations as they do. And it doesn't necessarily mean defeat, especially if you start early enough, because time does accelerate and there are often things you can do. These problems don't get better on their own in most cases. And what you find yourself in is essentially a decision funnel where you start at the top with a lot of options, and then as time passes, your options narrow because counterparties get harder to negotiate with. Once people think you're in distress. Everyone's looking out for their own interest, as they should. And it gets harder to negotiate good terms with people. And as your cash flow position deteriorates, that all of that contributes to having fewer options. And so the more proactive you can be, the earlier you start engaging in a discussion, and keeping an eye out for the signs of things that are signs of not are just signs of potential trouble. Like you've got big loans coming due, and it's not clear how those are going to be repaid. Your cash flow has hit recently. A surprising number of recent matters, they're often shareholder or management disputes. They're hugely distracting from the operations of the business, and they can often contribute to a distress. But a restructuring or a formal insolvency process, that's a tool that a company can use in order to implement transactions. You can implement an operational and or financial restructuring, but there's often a lot that you can do on an out-of-court basis, and you might be able to complete transactions or a restructuring entirely outside of a formal proceeding, or you might do 90% of it beforehand, and then use a proceeding just to implement something. Because I think one of the things that people are often surprised when they come into an insolvency is that once you're in a formal insolvency proceeding, the court has a lot of power, and you can get things done in a way that you just can't in the ordinary course.
Yeah, I guess I would just add to what Lisa said as far as, sort of signs of distress and things. There are obviously plenty of examples where it's through no fault of the companies themselves that, you may have a supplier that, has its own problems, and as a result has a really negative impact on your business, or, one of your key customers, has their own problems, which then become your problems and things like that. So as Kent said, coming to terms with the fact that you're facing some challenges is obviously a large part of the challenge we find. And, it doesn't mean that anyone's necessarily done anything wrong. It's, just sometimes can be a symptom of the situation. And I guess COVID is a big one of those, that there's no point in trying to sort of pretend that things are better than they are in the current environment, because like Lisa said, the more time you have, and the quicker you come to this realization, the more time you have, the more options you have available to you. We unfortunately often get phone calls from people when they can't do simple things like meet their payroll within a week or so's time, and that just really doesn't leave a lot of runway for engaging with your stakeholders and talking through what the options are, and what the solutions may be, whether it be outside of a formal insolvency proceeding, or even using it as a tool like Lisa said. Because I think the perception sometimes is that once you enter an insolvency proceeding, that's the end. But the reality is that the way the statutes are designed, the processes are supposed to rehabilitate, unfortunate debtors. So they can be used to your advantage, and in order for you to come out the other end of it in a stronger position. So, as businesses are looking to sort of pivot themselves through this the pandemic process, if there are divisions and things that are no longer profitable and don't make sense to continue with in the new post-pandemic world, sometimes an insolvency proceeding is not a bad way to deal with those. But there's a host of options, and it's about starting to think about them sooner rather than later, so that you have more of those available to them. Would be my comments.
Yeah.
And
then,
oh, please go ahead, Lisa.
I was going to say, it's also like we've been pretty focused on, like, you yourself are, if the company is in distress, it's also important to keep an eye on what are your key contracts, who are your key suppliers, your key customers, and be alive to potential signs of distress with them, because as Sarah mentioned, other people's problems can become your problems. And so those handle on key counterparties and monitoring how they're interacting with you, looking for signs of trouble, and depending on who they are, maybe it may be semi-public, is often a good proactive step to help help mitigate issues before they arise.
That's a fascinating point, and actually makes me ask you another question, and I think you addressed it to some extent, that what's the role that professional advisors play in this respect? How could they help companies to look at the options that are available to them and actually help them face the reality and set up a plan before it gets too late?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways that advisors can help. And one is that there are options in insolvency processes that most people, a lot of lawyers, are not aware of. That you can use it to terminate contracts, and damages associated with that go into a bucket of liabilities to be dealt with. It's an effective way to shut down uneconomic sections of your business. The termination of contracts point comes up a lot in the retail space, to get out from under some onerous leases. And I think it's mostly that they can bring to you options that you wouldn't otherwise be aware of, and the licensed insolvency trustees, the PwCs, can provide that assistance as well. But it's often, I find, sometimes helpful just to have someone come in that is objective, because most business relationships come with it a host of history and personal relationships. And most business people and entrepreneurs are optimistic by nature. And any challenges in the relationship, you've always been able to work through them before. And so the expectation is you'll be able to do so again. But having someone come in without all of that history, they can look at it and say, actually, this contract doesn't say what you think. Like, you've all been carrying on as if it says this, but this is what it actually says. And you can, it can just help you identify some issues and some other options. And PwC, like the licensed insolvency trustees, they help with operational issues as well, and they can provide a lot of guidance and assistance just at a business level as well.
Yeah, and I guess one of the others, we spoke about the banks and their role in this, and they are often, your lender is a key stakeholder in this, and managing your relationship with them is often as much a part of the process as managing your own operations, because no one likes surprises, and I guess there tends to be a bit of a tendency to sort of try and pretend that things are better than what they really are. And if you then spring a surprise on the bank, that can have some negative impacts on the relationship. A lot of the work we do often is just helping companies get their formula or articulate their strategy when they do find themselves in a position that they didn't expect to be in, and how they plan to navigate their way through that. And there's so much as not enough information, and there is definitely a case of too much information. And I think sometimes people tend to want to overshare, and that can be to the detriment of the relationship as well. So we just spend a lot of time often working with our clients on what the story is and how that can be best articulated, and how that strategy can be shared with their stakeholders to get their buy-in, and make sure everyone's working towards the same common goal, which is the successful turnaround of this company. So it's an objective lens, as Lisa said. We're not your advisors are not emotionally involved, and they also have a lot of experience dealing with companies in these situations. So we do tend to know what it is that the lenders are looking for to support companies going through these sorts of situations.
Yeah, sometimes in addition, to the insolvency trustees or the financial advisors like the PwCs of the world, companies, particularly larger companies that have bigger issues, they may be wise to hire somebody on their staff. We call them a chief restructuring officer, somebody that again is not part of the problem, has experience as being an insolvency trustee, but can work with management within the company to deal with these things. I mean, these are very tough conversations to have with lenders and suppliers and employees, and a lot of people just aren't equipped to deal with them. And so sometimes it's really smart for management to bring in somebody that they can work with on a day-to-day basis that can liaise with the financial advisors like PwC and the lawyers and kind of take a little bit of the emotion out of it. And so, a chief restructuring officer that works together with the financial advisors and the lawyers also can be helpful in those circumstances.
Yeah, there's no question that if you find yourself in a situation like this, managing the process itself is obviously quite an undertaking, let alone, it can take management's attention off the core business, which, obviously is to the detriment of, what the actual plan is, trying to get that back to full performance. So Kent's absolutely right. So sometimes it needs a little bit more manpower than you have currently and to do that.
And Claire, you mentioned banks a few times, and it actually came up in our previous conversation. And actually, this makes me think about the crisis of 2008. And one of the issues that we faced in that crisis was moral hazard. That we saw that the government bailouts actually encouraged banks, or that was the argument, that encouraged the banks to take on excessive risk at the expense of taxpayer. And I would like to ask you, all of you actually, this question, that do you perceive a problem of moral hazard again, that because of all the government support programs that this time are available to companies and businesses, so this is not a banking crisis anymore, but all those programs, do you think that they actually may exacerbate the problem of moral hazard and actually provide companies with incentives not to take active measures or to delay taking action? I would be very curious to hear your thoughts on that too. So anyone?
I don't know that the programs are necessarily encouraging people not to take action. I think that I think you find people reacting in a variety of ways, and it has a lot to do with, I think, at the end of the day, businesses are made up of people, and everyone reacts to things a bit differently. And so I think that you've got some businesses who are more proactive and are taking and are using the time that's been afforded by the increased opportunity to negotiate and the additional time that the subsidies are providing them, and they're really using that time to take some proactive steps and get their house in order, so that they'll come out of the crisis stronger. Others are more inclined to take a wait and see approach, and others are maybe putting their heads in the sand a bit. And I think it's all of those, where people fall on that spectrum is going to be a factor of what's their business, how is their business affected by the slowdowns or lockdowns, and a bit of their relationships with their lenders and key suppliers, and then you add into it just the personalities of the people involved, because they'll approach things differently.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a tough one to say, because we are in the middle of a global pandemic, which is affecting not only the corporate world, but people personally. And it's a little hard to say if somebody's not taken the action you might think was prudent in their business, that that was an intentional decision, as opposed to just they've got that much on their plate that they are they can't afford to. They're just treading water and trying to survive from day to day, and manage their personal lives around that. So I guess that's it. When you don't have the ability to, like Lisa said, sit back and think about things a little more strategically and act a bit more proactively, to position yourself better to come out of this. It's unfortunate. Is it your intention, or is it just the circumstance that you find yourself in? Each situation is going to be a little bit different, but I don't know that we could necessarily blame the subsidies and the support that people are getting from the bank.
It's probably a bit of both, like the circumstances of the business and just personal.
Yeah.
I would like to change gears again. So we talked about the challenges, we talked about the defensive strategies that companies could use, and that was a great discussion. And now I would like to ask you about the opportunities that the COVID crisis actually provides for companies which are well capitalized and have a strong balance sheet. what do you think that actually the pandemic has created any of those opportunities? If any particular sector that you think those opportunities are particularly visible? Perhaps Kent, you would like to start the discussion.
Sure. I'm not sure that there's any particular sectors that are visible, but there certainly is a lot of well-capitalized, a large well-capitalized pool of buyers out there. I mean, particularly private equity has, I don't know the number, but trillions of dollars of dry powder available to deploy into purchases of businesses or assets. And of course, if you can buy assets, buy low, sell high, now's a nice time to make those investments. For a strategic company looking to consolidate a sector or add to its business, and they have a strong balance sheet, again, lots of opportunities here. I think there's a couple things that are slowing that down. One is I don't think people are wanting to see exactly what happens. So, right now the market is quite uncertain. So uncertainty breeds, delay and hesitation. And so, maybe people are waiting to see, when are we going to hit bottom? When are the subsidies going to come off? When can we get the best buys? The pandemic has also inhibited the normal course of buyer processes. I mean, one of the biggest things is being able to conduct due diligence on the business or assets you're buying. And if you're a private equity company, based in Houston, Texas, and you want to buy a business in BC, how do you actually get to BC to touch and feel and smell the assets? I mean, that's a big part of what you're doing, especially if it's a distressed company where the assets may not be perfectly maintained, or, you need to ensure that they're in working order. How do you actually physically do that? Or if you want to buy a management team with a business, how do you get to know the management team if you're just doing it by Zoom calls and those types of things? So those types of obstacles, I think, are slowing down the process. Now they're being overcome. We're seeing this all the time. We're seeing remote due diligence, people doing, video due diligence, Zoom calls with management. I mean, people are overcoming these obstacles, but there still are obstacles. And so I think we haven't quite got to the spot where everybody's jumping in with both feet into the sales process. But for sure, there will be opportunities for those that have the wherewithal to buy businesses and assets to do so.
Yeah, there's often in insolvency processes, there's often companies that find themselves in formal proceedings, there's often a sale process for the business, either selling it as a going concern or selling part of it as a going concern or selling the assets. They often run dual track processes where you're seeking either a sale of the business or assets or an investment. And so there are a lot of opportunities for those who are not distressed themselves, but they have an interest in the assets, like they can pick up those assets of a competitor, or they want to diversify, they want to shore up supply chains, and there's a lot of ways that those transactions can come, but it's important when you're pursuing a distressed transaction as the potential buyer or investor. It's a good process in that you will, if it's a court supervised sale process, you'll get a vesting order, all of the claims will be free and clear. You get a lot of what is normally addressed through covenants is addressed through a court order. And so the paperwork associated with the transaction is often significantly streamlined. The flip side to it is that you're going to be buying it as is, where is. So you've got to be pretty comfortable with what diligence you've done. And so this period of a bit more uncertainty, where things are a bit slower on the opportunities coming to the market, this is a good time to be evaluating what opportunities might be out there for you, what competitors or suppliers have are potentially going to find themselves in a sale process, and you can start thinking about those things in advance, because they often happen very quickly. And it's important, I think the most important thing if you're participating in one of those processes is that you're going to have to move much more quickly than an ordinary transaction would, because the seller's sale process is going to be driven by their liquidity, which is limited, and so they're going to need a transaction quickly.
Claire?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Lisa on that. I guess we are actually across our group seeing a number of, like a lot of M&A activity, not necessarily in the distressed space at the moment. I guess everything sort of fell off a cliff as the pandemic hit, and you know, it went quiet for a few months there, but we have seen a lot of buyers coming back, and transactions that were put on hold as the pandemic sort of, the initial lockdowns came into place, are actually starting to complete now, as well as, you know, a lot of sort of A-grade companies are still being brought to market, those that have sort of had a minimal impact by the pandemic and still are, you know, performing very well, being brought to market. And to Kent's comments, you know, there is a lot of money out there. People are looking for good assets, and I guess what we feel at the moment we're not seeing, which, you know, ties to the earlier comments, the lack of sort of actual distressed, you know, insolvency proceedings and things, is that there aren't actually a lot of distressed assets being brought to market yet. It is just a lot of regular M&A activity as the general feel in the market at the moment going on. So there is, you know, with the expectation that as this government support sort of tailors off and maybe banks' patience sort of starts to wear a bit thinner, you know, these opportunities will come up, and it's a case of sort of getting yourself best positioned to take advantage of those when they do. And as Lisa said, you know, there's lots of ways to participate through the proceedings. I mean, you know, you don't need to just be a purchaser. You know, there's opportunities to sort of, you know, be a dip lender initially, and you know, the view to sort of credit bidding an asset, and you know, just sponsoring a plan through an insolvency proceeding. And they're all quite technical terminologies, and you know, they're not that difficult once you sit down and sort of have someone explain them to you. But you know, if you are looking to, if your strategy to, you know, grow out of this pandemic does involve M&A and the acquisition of some, you know, other businesses or assets, now would be a good time, we believe, to start sort of preparing yourself for that, and educating yourself on the process that may be involved to get access to those assets. We've been working on a transaction recently that you know, there was sort of 5 or 6 interested parties, and unfortunately, in the end, there really was only one potential offer that was in a position that the court could approve. So, and the reason for that was just that the other parties couldn't quite get their heads around the time and the urgency, and you know, these assets, because you are buying whereas, they do come with an increased level of risk, but that is usually reflected in the price. So there's an element of getting your head around, people getting their heads around the additional risk that they are taking on, and you know, being able to get to the point where they can make an offer for these assets in the time frame that is, you know, what required by, as Lisa says, the company's liquidity or the form of proceeding that they find themselves in. Because if you can't get the offer in time, you know, it may not be the best party that wins, unfortunately, in the end.
Yeah. And that happens all the time. There are parties that just can't get their, they might have they might be able to put together a technically higher offer, but they just can't get their financing together in time, or they just can't get themselves comfortable with the assets quickly enough. And so it's a huge opportunity if you're able to be nimble and be prepared.
And the one other thing that may start to happen, I don't think we've seen a lot of it yet, is the very aggressive buyer strategies of sort of the loan own type people, or that parties that come in and buy the debt from banks or other third-party lenders. They become the secured lender. Then they foreclose on that debt and they grab the assets that way. You know, so you buy the paper at a huge discount to market, get it off the bank or the lender's balance sheet, and then you scoop the business. We haven't seen a lot of that, but it's certainly a tactic and something that people should be aware of. And as you know, if the economy worsens, or as lenders positions start to worsen and their books look under stress, you may start to see more of existing lenders, even chartered banks, selling their debt to third parties and just saying, it's yours now, do with it what you will. And so, we haven't seen a lot of that yet, but we are working in our firm on a couple of files where, Canadian chartered banks are selling their debt to third parties, and who knows what they're going to do with that.
Well,
I guess that can really, from the company whose debt's been sold, that can really change the party that you're negotiating across the table with. So, your long-term relationship with your secured creditor, when that person changes and it is a more aggressive sort of third party buying those distressed debt, they've got different views on it, and you may not be ready for that, I guess, as we've seen it. They have a different sort of a strategy once it's a distressed debt fund owning those sorts of loans.
this is a really fascinating discussion. I have a long list of questions that I would like to ask you, but unfortunately we ran out of time. I would like to thank you very much all for sharing your thoughts and insights. It was a fascinating discussion. And I would also like to thank our audience who will later on watch this discussion. So thank you very much to you all, and also thanks to Andrew for organizing this very interesting panel.
Thank you.
Thanks.